James, you can go ahead and get started. I'll move them over as soon as they arrive.
Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and do that now. I call this meeting to order. This meeting is being held pursuant to and in compliance with Emergency Ordinance 20 TAC Alpha 16, emergency ordinance to ensure the continuity of government during the COVID-19 disaster. The committee members who are electronically present at this meeting are David Storm, Roger Schickadance, MK King, Karen Davenport, Sean Bridge, Robert Finley, Tom Thorpe, myself, and Andrew Baxter, as well as Supervisor Price, and county staff members Tori Kanopoulos, Chris Taggart, and Carolyn Schaefer. The persons responsible for receiving public comment are the 5th and Avon Community Advisory Committee. The opportunities for the public to access and participate in the electronic meeting are posted in the Albemarle County calendar. Craig Roller is not going to be here this evening. He let me know in advance, so I'm going to try and do double duty and take notes as well as chair the meeting. So please be patient with me if you hear any lags in communication on my end. It's me furiously scribbling away. And before we launch into the agenda, we've got a new committee member, at least new to me. Andrew, were you present at the last meeting, or is this your first?
No, this is my my second meeting.
Well, for my benefit anyway, can you just introduce yourself super briefly?
Sure. Andrew Baxter, lived in the county since about 1990. My wife and I live in Foxcroft. My wife Barb's a 30+ year member of the team at UVA Health. She's a nurse practitioner in surgical trauma ICU. I spent 20 years with Henrico Fire, 5 years as the fire chief in the city of Charlottesville. Worked for Habitat for the last year. Recently left there, and we just started a small business to give some employment opportunity to our adult son with disabilities. And if it works well, hopefully opportunity for other adults with disabilities in our community too. So really excited to be a part of this group. We've lived in this area for quite some time and seen it grow a lot. And we're interested in playing a role and seeing how that happens in the future as well.
Hey, that's awesome. We're thrilled to have you in the group and certainly welcome you and really value your presence here. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
At this point, it feels like a million years ago, but let's review the June minutes. Does anybody have any corrections they'd like to bring up on the record? All right, I make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
By Karen. Thank you, Karen. And with that, we'll turn it over to Chris. Chris, thank you for joining us tonight, and look forward to your presentation on entrance quarters in the ARB.
Sure, no problem. Chris Taggart here, design planner with the county. Margaret Malachevsky and I handle entrance quarter ARB review. I have a short presentation that Margaret created, and I'll be available afterwards to answer any questions.
James, I think you should actually do a vote rather than just a motion and a second on the minutes.
Thanks, Donna. Let's do a vote. Please raise your hand if you approve the minutes. All right, Chris.
All right, to the presentation.
Hello, and thank you for your interest in the Albemarle County. Hello, and thank you for your interest in the Albemarle County Architectural Review Board. This presentation is designed to provide a general understanding of what the Architectural Review Board does, how the design review process works, and what an entrance quarter is. Let's start by defining the term entrance quarter. An entrance quarter, or EC for short, is a street that travels to or through a historic area, and the designation provides for an extra layer of design review for new development along that street. The Albemarle County Zoning Ordinance currently lists several entrance quarter streets. The first entrance quarters were established in 1990. They include all the streets highlighted in yellow on this map. They include the primary commercial corridors in the county, like Route 29 North and Route 250 East, and they also include some streets that are more rural in character, like Route 20 South. In 2000, Airport Road and Hydraulic Road were added to the overlay. In 2005, Rye Road East was added. And most recently, in 2018, the John Warner Parkway was added as an entrance corridor. Entrance corridors are overlay zoning districts. That means that entrance corridor requirements are in addition to the requirements of the underlying zoning district. For example, Route 29 North is an entrance corridor. Many of the properties along Route 29 have some type of commercial zoning, highway commercial, for example. That commercial zoning has requirements associated with it. Those requirements remain in place, and the entrance corridor requirements are added to them. The entrance corridor overlay includes parcels that are adjacent to the street, and the full depth of the adjacent parcel is included in the overlay. The EC overlay also includes parcels or portions of parcels that are not adjacent to the street, but are within 500 feet of the right-of-way. In this image, the red crosshatch shows property that falls within the overlay. There's one more important point to note when we talk about overlay limits. The limits pertain to the parcels as they existed at the time the street was designated an entrance corridor. So, even if an adjacent parcel with a depth of more than 500 feet is subdivided after the street is designated an entrance corridor, those subdivided parcels remain in the overlay. The Virginia State Code allows localities to establish entrance corridors and to regulate aesthetics. To be an entrance corridor, state code requires that a street meet two criteria. One, the street has to be designated as an arterial street or highway. Two, the street has to be a significant route of tourist access. Albemarle's entrance corridors provide access to or through the county's and the city's historic landmarks, structures, and districts. Development on these streets receives the extra layer of design review for reasons that are set out in the county's comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance. One purpose of the overlay is to establish and maintain orderly and attractive development. This helps meet the comprehensive plan goal that says attractive entrance corridors will welcome visitors and residents to and within the county. The other primary purpose is to ensure that the new development is architecturally compatible with the historic architecture of the area. Entrance corridor review is necessary whenever there is a requirement for a site plan amendment, or a building permit in the entrance corridor overlay. That includes initial site plans, final site plans, all types of site plan amendments, and any type of building permit, including sign permits. The site plan review covers all site features, including the site layout, grading, landscaping, and lighting. It also includes the architectural design. Review of applications in the entrance corridors can take two different routes. Staff level review is available for proposals that are less complicated and expected to have limited visual impacts. They include things like signs, buildings that are more distant from the street, minor changes to existing buildings, and changes to equipment and lighting. Staff can review and approve these applications without going to an ARB meeting. More complicated proposals are reviewed by staff, a report outlining recommendations is prepared, and the report is presented to the Architectural Review Board in a public meeting. An approval from the ARB is called a Certificate of Appropriateness. Considering requests for certificates of appropriateness is the ARB's primary duty, but the ARB has other duties as well. They include recommending areas to be included in the overlay district, advising other bodies on land use matters, promoting the entrance corridor design guidelines, and reviewing initial site plans. ARB approval, the Certificate of Appropriateness, is required prior to site plan approval and prior to building permit approval. ARB applications are reviewed according to the entrance corridor design guidelines. The guidelines outline some very specific requirements. For example, 3 1/2 inch caliper large shade trees are required along the street frontage. But the guidelines also allow for a substantial degree of discretion and flexibility on the part of the ARB. For example, the guidelines also state buildings should relate to their site and the surrounding context of buildings. ARB meetings are public meetings, not public hearings. That means the meetings are open to the public, but they have different advertisement requirements, and there is no requirement for accepting public comment. Typically, however, the ARB has chosen to allow public comment. There are a number of actions that the ARB can decide to take in the public meeting. The ARB can provide a list of comments for the next round of review. They can approve an application as proposed. The ARB can approve an application with conditions. The ARB can agree to defer the review of an application, and they can deny an application, though that rarely happens. Typically, the ARB works with applicants to revise a proposal until it meets the guidelines. ARB actions may be appealed to the Board of Supervisors. Let's look at a few applications that were reviewed by the ARB. The first example we'll consider is the CVS Pharmacy at the intersection of Rio Road and Route 29 North. This slide shows a landscape plan that was submitted early in the review process. It includes very little landscaping along the Route 29 frontage. The EC guidelines call for large shade trees, interspersed ornamental trees, and shrubs along the frontage. This is a revised plan submitted in an attempt to address ARB comments. In this plan, shrubs were added, but no trees. There are utilities and easements across the frontage, so meeting the guidelines was challenging. In the end, after continued review and revisions, ornamental trees were added to the frontage. And the plan was approved. This image shows the completed building and the landscaping in place. This example is a car dealership at Pantops. The original proposal is shown in the pictures at the top. They show the standard franchise design at the time, which does not have a strong connection to the historic architecture of Albemarle. In the upper right image, you can see a sign reading Anytown. This is a clear example of how many businesses want their buildings to look the same everywhere, regardless of the context. It is a clear example that the unique context of Albemarle has not been considered. The image on the bottom is the design that was approved and constructed. It shows a connection to local architecture in the use of masonry materials, division of the elevations into a base, middle, and top, and repetition of architectural forms. This example is a more recent proposal for a renovation of the building at 2415 Ivy Road. The image at the top is the original design that was proposed. This original proposal removed the characteristics of the existing building that are representative of the historic architecture of the area. The ARB required changes to the proposal, and the design was revised to maintain the red brick and to add details that made it look less like a standard strip mall and more consistent with the industrial character of the property. This last example is a comparison of a local building with an approved comprehensive sign plan at the top of the slide and a non-local building without one at the bottom. In Albemarle's entrance quarters, comprehensive sign plans are required for buildings that house more than one tenant. The purpose is to provide a level of coordination in sign design across a building to help maintain an orderly and attractive appearance. On the building at the bottom, where there is no comprehensive sign plan, signs have no consistency in type, color, or placement. The result is a disorganized appearance and a development where competing signage is allowed to be the primary visual experience. On the building at the top, where there is a comprehensive sign plan, signs have some variation in color and letter style and can incorporate graphics. Consistency in sign type and a consistent placement on the building provide coordination, and the result is an orderly and attractive appearance. That concludes our overview of the Architectural Review Board process. We will be happy to try to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you for that, Chris. Do you have follow-on comments, or should we just start firing away with questions to you?
You can go ahead and start asking questions. I'll try to answer any.
Sure. And just as a reminder for the group, the sort of protocol that we operate here is raise your hand digitally, and I will do my best to be faithful in answering them in the order that I see the hands raised digitally, favoring panelists over attendees. But I wanted to ask a couple of sort of very quick level setting questions first. One is the entrance corridor is not really an ARB concern, right? That's something the ARB might weigh in on, but that's a VDOT determination whether a corridor has entrance corridor status or not. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah, or the arterial status of an entrance corridor. ARB or the Board of Supervisors establishes entrance corridors, but as probably coming up recently, they have to have arterial status, which is why Avon isn't currently, or is, but it isn't currently being reviewed as an entrance corridor with Architectural Review Board guidelines.
And that was exactly my follow-on question, was if you could refresh us on what the current sort of status with the county and with VDOT is of the Avon Street Extended Corridor.
So Avon Street Extended Corridor in particular is forms have been filled out to reestablish or establish it as arterial to bring back the Architectural Review Board guidelines and the review that comes with that.
Got it.
It's still in the pipeline or process.
Great. Thank you. Donna, I think I saw your hand first.
Thank you. Just wanted to let everyone know Supervisor Palmer texted me shortly after 7 o'clock. She was unable to connect on the internet, but she is listening to the meeting by telephone. So if the minutes could just reflect that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Donna. MK, I think I saw your hand next.
You're muted.
I think Tom was before me.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Go ahead.
Okay. My question is probably a tough one. It's sort of an overview question of the theory and the code behind maintaining this historical facade. Specifically, I think it was interesting in the example you used of the Ivy Road building, because personally, I liked the way that the proposed original plan looked better than what they had to come up with to stay with this sort of historical brick, I don't know, style. And so I'm just curious, at what point, you know, as a locality, do we start to allow some differing styles of architecture to make things more interesting?
Right, and that's definitely a balance that has been maintained of the connection to historic architecture and allowing for new development, new commercial styles, and also the entrance corridors look at kind of more the surrounding context. So with say the Route 29 entrance corridor, where there's largely commercial and there's less of that historic connection, there's more leeway in the interpretation of the guidelines. So it's really the guidelines that establishes or attempts to establish consistency, and then the surrounding context kind of establishes that leeway that there may be kind of less of a connection to historic architecture depending on the entrance corridor that development is being proposed in.
Tom, I saw your hand next.
Yeah, a couple of things. I've had experience going through the process, and it was not unpleasant. You know, one of the things I did take away was my first experience is how hard the people on the planning commission work at doing their jobs, and even more the ARB. These are people who spend a lot of time reviewing these things that go across the group, and they're all volunteers, much like we are. As much as I understand the process, and it's many hours and it takes a lot of time. And like I said, it did not significantly impact us on Avon Street, but the one thing I did take away was how much time it involved these people, both in planning and on the ARB. And so I'm curious, is there any budgeting? I know there's this push to reignite. And let me say, having lived on Avon Street down in Mill Creek area, and also living like Renovia and driving down Fifth Street, I do appreciate keeping the area attractive and not looking like a Miracle Mile. So I do appreciate the work, but is there any work done to estimate how many hours if you were to add Avon Street to the entrance corridor, how many man hours additionally is that going to mean to planning?
I'm not sure if there's been any focus in that, but I would add Avon Street had been reviewed as an entrance corridor. I think it stopped prior. I've been with the county almost 2 years now, so it's been fairly recent that Avon hasn't been reviewed as an entrance corridor, but up until that point, it had been any development proposals submitted along that Avon had been reviewed with entrance corridor regulations.
It got dropped right after we got approved. But just to speak to things, we had a number of very small household, I think there were 3 household size air conditioners that were, you couldn't see them from the road. And certainly you wouldn't see if there are any cars in the parking lot, and they were rusty. And planning wanted to know what was the color, the Pantone digital color of those little air conditioning units the size of a small chair, and wanted to know whether we could match those. That takes a lot of time for somebody to do that. And so I think we should understand what that costs are. The one request that I have, and then I'll drop off, is this application, because you're going to need to override on the arterial designation, and then there's obviously got to be some justification that this is a tourist lane. I'd like to get a copy of that application as it sits right now. Is that possible? Can the committee, the CAC, receive that?
The application to VDOT for
Yes.
status?
Yeah.
I can check into that, yes.
I'd like to get an advanced copy of that.
Okay.
Thank
I
you.
can definitely check into that.
Okay, thanks.
David?
I think Andrew was next.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Sure, yeah, I was just curious, the degree to which precedent is applied during this process. It just seems, I've not read the neighborhood guide, but or the guidance document that is used, but it seems like a pretty subjective process in a lot of ways. And maybe that's just my new lens, but to what degree is precedent drive the decisions that are made?
Precedents say such like along the entrance corridor of at a particular intersection, this was built. So it's built up off of that prior site plan, if I'm understanding your question.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sort of to MK's point, is there a progression here over time?
Right, and Mark and I definitely weigh that, and the board members weigh that heavily of in cases where we might establish presence of really reviewing the site plan thoroughly to make sure it's an appropriate design that the next applicant come in will definitely point to one way or another, positive or negative, of this was approved, why can't we do that? So that's definitely a consideration.
Wonderful, thanks.
I guess if I can leap in there and sort of echo Andrew's question and MK's, like it seems very subjective when you're looking at the car dealership, the design that they had versus the design that was said didn't reflect our current architectural standards. Like that's a pretty squishy statement, like reflecting Albemarle County's current architectural standards, unless you're pointing to specific instances. Like is red brick code, or is that just a preference?
Red brick, I wouldn't say red brick is code. It's preference, or establishes the connection to the historic architecture within the historic building material architecture that's within the county. But with the car dealership, and I think you're probably referring to 24 or 15 Ivy that was in the PowerPoint presentation. The car dealership is on within Pantops, which a lot of those buildings in that particular stretch of Pantops or Route 250 have been built prior to the establishment of the entrance corridor. So there is that kind of leeway in building renovation that it needs to have some connection, but the acknowledgement that it was, I think a lot of those were probably built in like the 70s or 80s.
Got it. But that's to some degree just sort of a subjective standard set by the ARB as it exists when the approval goes up.
Right. It gives a lot of, it's very subjective and it gives a lot of room for interpretation.
Okay. All right, David, am I queuing you up correctly now?
I think you are. Thank you. And actually, this led into one of my questions, and they're sort of both tied to the same area. And that is the question of pantops. Because you look at that, and I think you answered it already, Chris, that pantops doesn't really have a historic architectural style. And so anyone who comes in and wants to build something new or make some serious modifications to what they've got, I think you've got that BMW now. You've got some of these whitewashed brick buildings sort of on the top. I'm thinking of maybe that's Atlantic Union Bank that's up there. And then as you get on the other side, even though it's not visible from 250, you've got Martha Jefferson Hospital, which has a different color palette entirely. Because at that point on pantops, people take into account, I guess, and I want to know, this is where that part of the question goes, the role of Monticello in the process. If you look at the GIS, it asks if it's in the Monticello viewshed for properties in the county. Well, Monticello is, while it's it's a World Historic place, but it is private property. It's not owned by the county or any government. And what role might they play in this process? And then my last question has to do with, how do the corridor requirements keep up with changes in best practices in building, in terms of building materials, in terms of glasses that are low energy, in terms of things that are energy efficient that may not meet with the historic architectural standards?
Okay. To answer your question about Monticello, we do, depending on the kind of the site plan being proposed and the proximity, we do ask, but don't require, if they have reached out to the people at Monticello to kind of gauge their opinion in that particular area and within the county in general. Earth tones are kind of the dominant feature that kind of mitigate the appearance from Monticello and mitigate the appearance of building materials kind of within the county as a whole. So that'd be kind of a mitigating factor within new and existing developments. And then could you repeat your other question about, I think I got that the general gist of that one.
Yes, you did. Thank you. How do the guidelines keep up with changes in best practices for construction, whether they are low energy windows? I know that sometimes the standards call for a certain level of tinting or reflection in terms of windows like that. So how do the standards keep up with what are best building practices in terms of builders who want to use newer materials that may provide better energy savings, especially in light of the county's climate action plan?
Right. It's something that we kind of currently discuss, but we haven't got it in the kind of pipeline. I think it's continually upgrading and improving, but it's hadn't been something that we've recently done, especially in regards to kind of window tinting standards of checking if we're kind of behind the times and tinting possibly in comparison to energy code and current building standards related to the climate action plan, but it's something we are thinking about.
Great, thank you.
Roger, I think I saw your hand next.
I have a question about just what properties are applicable to the entrance corridor review. I'm thinking in particular of Galaxy Farm off of Route 20, where it's set back pretty far from the road. And so the question is, does the building have to actually be within the 500 feet setback, or is it any building that's on a property that's adjacent to the road? And also, is the entire development subject to the review, if that's the case?
In the case of Galaxy Farms, it would just be the townhomes, or in case of kind of any entrance quarter ARB review, the single family portion of that development wouldn't be reviewed against the entrance quarter standards or guidelines. And then parcels adjacent, the 500 feet don't apply to. It's parcels that aren't adjacent 500-foot depth applies to.
So, I mean, if all those properties are, the built property was beyond the 500-foot setback line, that means they would not be subject to review?
Correct, yeah.
Can I maybe ask a clarifying question? I think there's sort of two parts there. There's one is, are properties within 500 feet subject to entrance corridor review? And that answer is yes. If they're more than 500 feet away, even if they're part of the same development, they are not subject to entrance corridor review, but they're still subject to ARB review. Is that correct?
Entrance quarter and ARB review would be one and the same. And then let me pull an example, like Brook Hill, we look at, and that's a multi-phase development where we look at the visibility from the entrance corridor kind of after the buildings have been, or as the phases have gone up, if this particular building or particular phase is visible from the entrance corridor. So when a parcel, and Brook Hill's a parcel that's adjacent, is the entire parcel, but there is also that consideration of the visibility of particular phases of a development from the entrance corridor. So we as staff could bring it to the ARB and ask their opinion if it needs to be reviewed. That applies to parcels that are adjacent. It's the entire parcel.
So if any portion of the development is within that 500 feet or visible from the entrance corridor, the entire thing is potentially subject to ARB review? Is that
depending on or I guess staff, if we feel comfortable reviewing it, or depending on the board's feedback of the development.
okay? Donna, I saw your hand next.
Thanks, James. Two things. One, remember that entrance corridor overlay applies to a piece of property that's adjacent to the corridor. And the 500 feet is not controlling if that piece of property is later subdivided. The part of the property that's subdivided that is now more than 500 feet would still fall under the entrance corridor overlay, because at the time it was established, it was one piece of property that was adjacent. So it can get very complicated. And Chris, thank you for your explanation on those. The other thing I wanted to go back to, I think, David, this was your question, if not yours, whoever it was, on the Monticello view shed. There's a symbiosis between a lot of different moving parts, both the county, the city on the governmental side, as well as for this part of our industry, our tourism industry. And there are four primary attractions, if you will, that we have in Albemarle, Charlottesville, and that's Monticello, the University of Virginia, our winery, cideries, brewers, distilleries, meaderies, and the downtown mall, which then starts to hit a lot of hotels and restaurants. And so part of the balance we're trying to achieve is to maintain that attractiveness, particularly within the Monticello view shed, because of the impact that maintaining that beauty continues to have in drawing the type of tourism that we want. What's important to realize, though, in recognition that Monticello is not a governmental entity, and they do have an office, and I can't remember the title of it, but Liz Russell is the current incumbent there, and she is responsible for the Monticello view shed as development proposals that fall within that view shed apply. And it basically is a let's work together approach, because they cannot direct what a developer does. But we're very fortunate that we have, I think, a very positive relationship between our developers and their recognition of the things that we want to maintain in Albemarle County that continue to keep this as an attractive, a physically attractive place. And so generally, and I would say at least in the last 18 months or so that, I've been the supervisor, Monticello and the developers have always been able to come to a reasonable accord that results in what I would call the appropriate color schemes, heights of buildings, and those sorts of things that protect that view shed. And if you've ever walked around in the area at Monticello, Montalto, Saunders Monticello Trail, whatever it happens to be, it is wonderful to look out and see that, we don't have nothing but high rises and billboards and things like that. So it's really more of a symbiosis than it is a regulatory on the part of what Monticello's involvement is. Thank you.
And I'll add to Donna's point, also landscaping would be another important factor to mitigate the visibility from Monticello, landscaping.
Okay.
Thank you. I have a question for Chris, but first I want to just touch on what Donna said because I was going to say something about that too. So the Monticello view shed, I do understand the essence of it that Donna described, and I'm glad to hear that it works between developers and Monticello. But I have personally seen at least one instance where it had a direct impact on someone that I think is one of those unintended consequences. There's a residential neighborhood in the Pantops area. That's a newer development. It's almost completed, being built out now. But it happens to be in Pantops, but because of the topography of that area, you don't exactly see every house in the neighborhood from Monticello. And the people who, it's residential development, so there's like maybe 10 houses there. I don't know, it's not a big neighborhood. It's adjacent to several other neighborhoods. And I had a client who built a house in there who was not allowed to have a white house. You can't have a white house. And they were told, you cannot have this because the county tells us that Monticello says you cannot have this. So the way that it's being portrayed to people is not necessarily the way, that you just described it. And that's probably because of the deal the developer made, like you said, with Monticello. Okay, we'll build this housing development, but we promise not to let anybody have earth, everybody's gonna have earth tones, like Chris said, which is fine. But are we overstretching, I guess is what I'm saying. Was that really necessary? Or is that just a consequence of this good effort everyone's trying to make? Because I can see it when it comes to very large commercial buildings. But when we're talking about, the color of someone's private residence, it just seems like maybe it was a little unnecessary. And that's just my thought on it. The other question I have for Chris is related to revisions of the county's architectural guidelines. So we've talked a lot about how the ARB makes their decisions somewhat subjectively, but somewhat based on these guidelines. And so I'm assuming that the county regularly reviews those and updates them as needed. And so can you talk a little bit about that process and what that's like?
Yeah, we're actually working through that process. I think it started probably the end of 2019, kind of slowly working through reviewing our architectural review entrance corridor guidelines and kind of updating and creating documents based off of those updates as needed. It's as you can imagine, it's kind of a slow and thorough process. So we haven't really gotten to the end of the light at the end of the tunnel yet on that, but we are going through that process currently to look at our entrance corridor guidelines and update and kind of flesh out as needed.
So that's a staff. So the staff is doing that, but is that something that ever like decisions go back to like the board or the planning commission or anybody like that?
So staff is, would bring it up, we kind of create the basis, it goes to the ARB, and it would be something that would need to go to, I'm not sure if they need to go to the planning commission, but it definitely need to go to the board of supervisors to be adopted prior to kind of any official changes to the entrance corridor guidelines.
So as time goes on, if we're having applications that are potentially regularly being denied for something that, you know, at what point does staff sort of take note, or could someone from the community come in and say, you know, the last 4 things have been denied because of this line in the sand, you know, in the documents, and we think it's time to move the marker, you know, to get that kind of on the agenda for you guys.
Right. Kind of as the presentation said, we haven't had anything ARB or architectural entrance corridor guideline review denied. I'm not sure, you can probably interpret that as there's been revisions to prevent that denial, but we haven't had any applications, right, at least submitted in the time period that I've been here, that have been flat out denied by the architectural review board. There's always that kind of push and pull of working with the applicant to come up with a design that's appropriate for the particular entrance corridor that it's being proposed in.
Thank you.
Don, do you have a comment on that?
Thanks. I don't want to get bogged down, but with regard to MK's comment, I want to be clear. Monticello does not have the legal authority to deny something that comes from the county. Now, the county may have listened very much to what they offered, and then, you know, I don't know the details of that particular house, but I do know one of the problems that we always deal with, whether it's increased traffic load, you know, one development may impact the roads, but 100 developments, suddenly now you've got a major problem. And, you know, once you open up, you know, this color scheme sort of a situation, one house may not be that visible, but then you get more of them, and then now your view shed is lost. So there is a bit of a tension there. That, I guess that's about all I can say. I really don't want to get bogged down in one particular case, but it is important, I believe, that we do protect the view shed, because that is such an integral part of what we are trying to maintain in terms of the aesthetics as it affects the quality of life and the attractiveness. So thanks for letting me have that additional comment.
Thanks, Don. Tom?
I'm getting quicker. Okay. Thanks, Chris. It was a nice presentation. I actually enjoyed it. It was enlightening. 2 things. One, James, if we can get that written into the record, a request, at least prior to submission, the form or the application, I'd like that included in the minutes. Second thing, Chris, and you may not know the answer to this now, but I am interested finding out, is there any kind of, you're in planning, right? Is that the actual department? Okay.
Yeah, umbrella. Yeah.
Great. So does planning have goals, cycle time goals, where when an application comes in, whether it's an LOR or any of these other minor site plan amendment, major, and then I guess things that go through the ARB. I know every application is different. They're all special, but do you have performance goals? Does the department have, you know, limit how long they're going to spend on something, or you know, I'm come from the drug business, so we submit applications to the FDA for a drug approval, and then they'll send it back, and then you wait 7 months, and then they respond to your answer, and that's how come drugs can take 3, 4, 5, 7 years for approval, is this cycle time, and we're negotiating heavily with the FDA to bring those cycle times back down, and that would be really attractive, at least to those of us in the light industrial world. When opportunities come, just getting the turnaround is enormously helpful, rather than fire and forget. And then you can't line up any kind of construction, any contractors, you can't get back to your customers because you don't know when, and then you don't know. So that's sort of my, do you guys have some metrics that you use in the department?
Not that I'm currently aware of. I can double check though and get back to you on that.
Fantastic.
Tom, I haven't been doing a great job of keeping minutes, but I've made sure that your request is one of the two things I've included in there.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any more questions for Chris before we thank him for his time and let him enjoy the rest of his evening in peace? Oh, David, I see one.
Yeah, not not for Chris, I think. Tom, I think, were you asking for the application for arterial highway status before it was submitted? Because I think that ship has sailed. My understanding was that went in a couple of months ago or more. Am I wrong on that, Chris, Tori, Donna? I know it had been before the board to get their okay.
I suspect you're right, Dave. I know Chris, you're going to answer in a sec. I think you are right, but the way Chris had answered that earlier when he said that the forms were getting filled out, that's why I thought there was still a window.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have a note that it's finalized, but I can double check. I know I am aware it's a multiple month process, but I'll double check if it's still in the pipeline or actually been submitted.
Chris, if it's submitted, I think Tom would, and I would probably appreciate a copy of even the final.
Still, yeah.
submission as well. Great. Any last questions? Well, thank you, Chris, for your time this evening and really appreciate you being here.
All right, thanks, no problem. Y'all have a good evening.
Yeah, you too, Chris. Thanks.
All right, thanks, bye.
All right, our next agenda item is development applications overview, and that's your show, Tori.
Yeah, thank you, James. So I will share my screen and get this little presentation pulled up. So this is just an overview of the site plans that are under review in the 5th and Avon CAC area. It's meant to be an update since the June CAC meeting. So we'll start with projects that were newly submitted, resubmitted, or approved since that June meeting. So first, we have Albemarle Business Campus. I think you're all pretty familiar with it, but this was approved with a rezoning to neighborhood model district, so mixed use. And it's kind of split into two main sections by this part of Old Lynchburg Road. And it's across from the county office building at 5th Street. So this plan should look a little bit familiar for those of you at the June meeting. This was in block 5 for the 103,000 square foot self-storage building and restaurant. So my update is just that it's been approved since last week. So that site plan is all set for that block. And then this is new since the last meeting. Block 1 has a final site plan under review with the first review comments due in mid-September. So this is along Country Green Road, kind of that crescent shaped parcel that's on the west side. And it's for 128 apartments and 5 buildings. So there's some associated parking and some amenity space, including a clubhouse and a dog park. Then Galaxy Farm, just talking about with ARB review. So that's along Route 20 next to the Avinity neighborhood and Mountain View. And this was approved with the rezoning as well a couple of years ago for planned residential development. So the rezoning allows up to 65 units, which is what they are proposing. And we did look at this in the June meeting, but this is slightly updated. So the previous initial site plan was just showing the townhouses. And so they've submitted instead a combined initial site plan and preliminary plat to show the whole development. So that shows all 65 units included there. And review comments are due later this month. And then this was discussed at the ARB on August 16th. There was no comments for the initial site plan, just that a certificate of appropriateness will be needed with the final site plan. And it looked like it was talking about these townhouse units here being visible from Route 20. Then we have Avon Park 2 next to the original Avon Park and along Avon Street Extended, backing up to Biscuit Run. So no significant updates on this project for the 28 townhouses and then the 2 existing houses to remain. But I did want to note that the road plans were approved since the last meeting. So road construction on these new streets can begin. So if you notice construction, it might be for that. And then we have Southwood. There's several site plans under review. And we did an update on Southwood last meeting, so I won't go into too much detail. Just noting the site plans are in this phase 1 rezoning area adjacent to the existing Southwood neighborhood. And so this is an overview from one of the site plans that shows how the entire phase 1 rezoning is planned to be built out. So I just wanted to note that there is a final site plan approved for this block 8, block 5, and block 7 area. It includes road plan approval for this road coming in and coming through this site. But the other parts of the development are in various stages of site plan review and are not approved yet. So there's a initial site plan that was approved for these 3 apartment buildings, which are right at the entrance off of Old Lynchburg Road. This is Hickory Street coming in. This is 121 apartments using low-income housing tax credits or LIHTC. This site plan was approved in early June. I don't think a final site plan has been submitted yet. Then there's an initial site plan under review for blocks 1, 3, 4, and 6. And so this area over here to the right are those other blocks that I mentioned with the final site plan that was approved. So you've got this road extending off of here and then looping back around and then including a total of 48 units mixed with single family attached, detached, duplex, and condos. So this is the first submittal under review, and those review comments are due in early September. So that's pretty early in the review process. And then blocks 9, 10, and 11. So coming back up closer to Old Lynchburg Road. This block 12 is where those apartments are planned for. And these units have a final site plan under review with first review comments due in early September. And that's for 86 units, including townhouses and a few condos. Then there's a few site plans that haven't had any changes or resubmittals since the June meeting. I did want to note, while it's not a site plan, the rezoning application ZMA 2021-5 at 1805 Avon Street, planned residential development. That's right next to the Avinity neighborhood, and there haven't been any resubmittals since the last meeting, and there's no public hearing scheduled yet. So I don't have any updates on that project either. So Spring Hill Village along Avon Street Extended and Route 20 across from Avon Park. That development is unchanged. It just continues to build out. So you probably notice continued construction there. There's been 31 certificates of occupancy or COs issued. So once the CO is issued, that means someone can actually move in and occupy the unit and live there. And then the other buildings are in various stages of building permit review, which is needed before the CO. And so they're continuing to build down from Avon toward 20. And then there was the Avon Court Industrial Building. So next to the Willoughby neighborhood and along Avon Street Extended and near the city-county border. And that project still does not have any updates. It's still been deferred. There haven't been any resubmittals on that as of yet. And then the White Gables development, which is near the Bel Air Market along Route 250 near the bypass. And across the street from Birdwood and Boar's Head. So that's technically a major site plan amendment since it's adding on to the existing condos that were approved that are right across the way. And so these 3 new buildings will have 42 units total. They'll have structured parking, and that's still under review. No resubmittals yet, but I think with the next resubmittal, it's pretty close to approval. And that's all I have. So happy to try to answer any questions or let you all discuss as well. Thank you.
Hey, go ahead, MK.
Thank you. I know this is a by right development, Tori, but what's the status of the one that I emailed you about Granger, I think is what it's called? Is that something we keep up with or?
Yes, I did look in County View, because I was going to include that one, but it looks like, the preliminary plat was denied. So just a quick overview of review process. That doesn't mean it can't actually happen or ever get built. But generally with preliminary plats and initial site plans, they're usually approved. It's called conditionally. So you include all the review comments with the initial letter and say, you know, we'll approve your project as long as you make all these changes per the zoning ordinance, subdivision ordinance, any other requirements. But if there's comments that are really, really substantial, then, you know, the planner may not feel that it should be approved even conditionally because significant revisions are needed. So it's not saying that the project can't happen. It's still by right, but I only looked at the review comments briefly. It looked like they had a lot of fire rescue and VDOT things to address. So I think, you know, but they can resubmit and address those comments. So denial is not, you know, a permanent denial. It just means, you know, you have some pretty important things to address. So we'd rather not approve the preliminary quite yet.
Thank you. And I don't know if everybody saw this one come through on the memos, but it is about, I want to say like 75 homes. I could have that wrong. At the end of Sunset Avenue Extended. So I live in the Oak Hill Farm neighborhood. And so this would be past Redfields, under 64, but still accessing it, you know, from this side. So Sunset Extended. And it's all the way at the end, basically backing up to Huntley, I think. Which is on
just
the other
across
side.
the city-county line in the county.
Correct. Yeah. And so obviously, since that would impact traffic at the intersection of Sunset Avenue Extended and Old Lynchburg Road, that might be what Tori's leaning towards as far as fire rescue. And VDOT. Thank you.
David?
There we go. Tori, thanks. This was a great presentation. I don't really have a lot. I had a question more about something that may have happened on Monday down towards Southwood. Do you know, does anybody know if Southwood is blasting? They need to blast for anything? There was sounds of an explosion that the people in and around our neighborhoods heard earlier this week. And I didn't know if anybody else had found anything with that. But I don't know if Southwood had to get required blasting permits or not, or Galaxy Farm. I know there are a lot of people moving dirt these days. Tori, did you know of any of that?
I do
Making a
not,
face
but
like,
I'm happy to check. I can definitely check on that. I'm just not sure offhand.
no, I didn't know if, with a number of the people who live in that sort of area in this group, I didn't know. The thing that gets me, and I think this is more of a question for Donna and Liz. Well, maybe not Liz, depending on the timing. We're reaching sort of a tipping point here that our neighborhoods in this part of the county, in the northern part of the county, and the western part of the county are all very popular destinations for people and people with families. They know that Albemarle County is a great place to raise a family. And we continue to see, we went to the open house today at Mountain View, and we see that they are leveling out part of the field out back to make way for 8 classroom learning cottage to address current overcrowding before we get to the expansion. So the rubber's kind of meeting the road here on what the county wants to be and what we want to be. Or we've seen some neighborhoods that have been denied in terms of some rezonings because of their impact on schools. But I think the people are still going to come, and we're going to still see, as we see through all of these developments coming through this part of the county in particular, people are going to want to be here because of the offerings that Mountain View has. So Donna, we may have some hard decisions in terms of what we want to do as far as taxes and services, as far, for the school division, as well as the county entirely coming. And I'm just, this is not so much about these specific developments, any one of these developments, but, as you were talking earlier, 10 homes may not make a difference on traffic, but 100 do. 10 homes may not make a difference in a school, but 100 will. So there may be some tougher questions about what we're going to be able to do. And I know that the school board's going to have to face those questions too, in terms of what they're going to be requesting from the county as far as funding, and are we going to actually be able to have a CIP as we move forward? I think we're hopeful that our CIP gets to be nice and robust again, but we may have a question there in terms of what we're able to do with the current tax rate. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I'm not going to, but there may be, have to be a look at what the tax rate is if we're going to want to provide the services that keep Albemarle as good as it's been for most of its residents.
Donna, do you want to respond to that now?
I can, or I saw Andrew's hand up first, but James, whichever way you want to go.
Yeah, Andrew's a newbie, so I'm cutting him off and letting you speak.
Okay.
And so this is how you treat rookies, huh?
So several things. One, Liz texted me just as James or David was saying, I don't know that Liz can answer this question, and said, we asked him to unmute me so I can make some comments. So, great minds were thinking alike. Two, I've had several conversations with our Scottsville representative on the school board, Ellen Osborne, and not to speak for Ellen, not to speak for the school board, but I have the clear impression that the school board recognizes that they are way behind on where they need to be in CIP and expanding the schools. That's clearly the impression I have, but that's a topic that the school board specifically has to address. And third, I would say that I will be surprised if we are not looking at an increase in the tax rate, because we do have a lot of things we get done. And as a rapidly developing county, we're not the rural county, we're not Nelson County. Scottsville District has almost as many people as Nelson County in its entirety. So we do have a lot of growth. And I did notice from our most recent construction report that the Scottsville District is right at the top in the number of new units that are going in. So I definitely believe that we are going to have to look at increasing our school capacity, because you're exactly right. A house here or a house there or a few houses doesn't make a difference. But you look at, and by the way, Tori, that was a fabulous report. You covered tons of material, succinctly to the point, made it all very clear. Great report. That shows what's going to happen with our schools. And again, I try to be very careful and not step into the boundary, into the lane with the school board. But yeah, we're going to have to see something taking place on that.
Liz, do you want to weigh in too? No, I can't hear anything from Liz unless anybody else can.
No, you're unmuted, but Liz, you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. You can.
How about
text.
now?
Yeah, there
I
you
can
go.
hear you.
Okay, great. Okay. I apologize. I was like wanting to make comments way back then. I have to say one thing, if we can just go back, and then we can go back to the schools. And yes, we need to have more school capacity. There's no two ways about that. But the Granger property, this is really important, and for this committee to look at. I don't really understand where we are with it, and Tori I didn't quite understand if she was sure where we were with it or not. But this is a property that, if it's possible, even though it's a by right, for the county to discuss another entrance or exit from that development, it would be really wonderful, because even though it's a by right development, it may be a situation where the county wants to put money into it to try to help them with another entrance or exit to that property. And I wanted just to throw that out. If Tori could comment on that, or if we could at some point have that come back to this group and have them take a look at that, so that when it does really come up to be built or whatever, we're ahead of it about trying to get an additional entrance on that, because it really needs it. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, can we reconnect Sunset Avenue? I mean,
Yeah,
isn't that the solution?
Well, the city, as far as I can tell, has no interest in that whatsoever, and nor do the people who live on the other side. So, that's another issue. But I think we should be looking at that development very carefully to see how we can make it better, even as a by right development. Maybe the county can put something into that to try to make it better. And I don't know if there's a way to do that. That's for the planners to see if there is a way, and to let the county know, let the board of supervisors or whatever know if there is if there is something to be done there. And then we can maybe talk to the developers, because I have heard many times over the years that they are not interested in doing anything but by right development there. So anyway, I don't know the answer to your question, but I wanted to bring it up.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Andrew, for your patience.
I'm sure, absolutely. On that Sunset Avenue question, one potential pathway to explore, just from my previous profession, would be to do an analysis of response time impact if that road continued. So you've got the Fontaine station there, and the current first 2 units coming to that part of the county are either coming from the Ridge Street Fire Station or the Monticello Station. So my prediction, and it's purely subjective at this point, would be that you'd see a dramatic improvement. So I don't know if that moves the needle very far in terms of shared investment in a bridge over that creek, but it'd be something worth pursuing probably. My question was really sort of building on what David talked about. I'd be really interested in seeing sort of a global service level impact analysis. Obviously, the impact on the schools is front of mind, but we really probably ought to be looking at the whole lifespan, if you will, of a community and its members to be able to fully understand the service demand impact. So obviously, I'm going to say public safety, police, fire, and EMS, but also social services, transit, recreation, parks, et cetera, et cetera. Some of those things are fairly easy to calculate with some reasonably valid data. Some are not, but I think a comprehensive analysis, if that doesn't exist, would be really helpful for us, for anybody.
Donna or Liz, do you want to comment on that before I move on?
Well, I think that the modeling that the fire and rescue folks do pretty much keeps up with that well. I understand what you're talking about with the development. I think that's probably a appropriate thing to do. I think we also need to understand where we've had a lot of building lately, and it's going to affect our master planning and whatnot in all the different areas. And I think it's really important to understand the number of apartments and whatnot that we've had in the different areas also, just to throw that out. And that's something board members have asked for also, to sort of get a handle now on where all this building is going in and what's already been approved. So I don't know if Donna has anything else to say on that.
Sean, over to you.
Thank you, James, and Tori, thank you again for that great presentation. So talking about that Granger property, I had heard years ago when they were kind of doing the second phase of Fontaine Research Park, that it was designed with an access road or an easement that would allow Sunset Avenue to kind of curve off, through what I think is this piece of property, and connect through to Fontaine to give you a second way out. But I've never seen it on a map. Does anybody have any idea if that's in any way accurate?
My understanding is that by right doesn't require them to have that. And so the question is, are they definitely going to do that?
Thanks, Liz.
And I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think that proposed connector is in the master plan though, but again, that's one of those aspirational things more so than a required thing. But that Sunset Fontaine connector, I believe that's where it is. I do actually believe that's in our current master plan for the area.
Good. Thanks, David.
David, did you have another question as well? Any more on Dory's presentation?
James wanted to jump in real quick and say that I'll follow up on those questions with the Granger property. I'll have to go back. I can't remember offhand who the lead reviewer is, but I'll follow up with them. I don't think it's been resubmitted since it was denied, but assuming that they're going to address those comments and resubmit, I'll follow up with the lead reviewer, let them know about these questions as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Dory.
Because it's Kevin.
From here, our next agenda item is the Board of Supervisors update. I'd say Planning Commission Board of Supervisors updates. We don't have any planning commissioners tonight, so it's just our Board of Supervisors. So Donna and Liz, it's over to you.
I'll go ahead and start just because it's probably a little easier with me being online rather than the phone. Several things, and then Liz, if you will fill in gaps and add things I overlook. We had a couple of really big things yesterday, and frankly, to me, the biggest one was a presentation by Jody Yeager called Mapping Albemarle. And I had seen him in February or March, I can't remember exactly when, do a similar presentation called Mapping Charlottesville for the Charlottesville chapter of the National Organization for Women. What he has done with his team of volunteers is they've gone through and looked at all of the land records and identified parcels and plots and areas where there were racially restrictive covenants that were put into the property. And it's not just, only white people, no black people. It's no Serbians, no Greeks, no Jews. I mean, it was extensive, the xenophobia, the racism that was built into our land use. And that becomes important because that then is the basis upon which generational wealth for those who are able to own land and generational poverty for those who are precluded from owning land ends up affecting not only that family, but generations afterwards. It's somewhat like when I went to Farmville a few years ago for the anniversaries of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, and then 1959 with massive resistance, and then 1964 with them, the Supreme Court finally just saying enough. I mean, they actually shut down the schools for 5 years in that county. And that county went from pre-1954 being one of the wealthiest counties in the United States to post this 10 or 15 year period being one of the poorest counties in Virginia. And it actually ended up impacting not just the Black families who were denied an education for 5 years, but it also affected the white families because the interstate highway system wouldn't go near Farmville. And there are these impacts that affect both the discriminators and the discriminated. And so Mr. Yeager, he took this information and he presented it on Mapping Albemarle. And it wasn't quite as complete as he had been able to do for the Mapping Charlottesville. I think he had a little bit more time to work on that one, but it really was important. And it's important to me as I kind of mature into being the supervisor that I am and will be, because when you look at the racially discriminatory language that precluded people of color from living in neighborhoods, that meant that they weren't able to buy houses. And we know that home ownership has historically been the greatest method for people to lift up their own family and their generational wealth. And where that ties in with me is when we look at the different types of housing that is being proposed and approved in the county. And this has come up fairly recently with the Crozet Master Plan, and in particular, the desire on the part of some members of the community to limit different types of housing that might be there. And, when we looked at the Albemarle Business Campus, we had a similar sort of a thing in the respect that the residential side of that development, there were two proposals that we looked at. One would have had two different types of housing, and one had one type of housing. And the board ultimately approved only one type of housing. Our argument being that there were other types of housing within a quarter mile or something to that effect. And so where I look at it is I would like to see a broader diversity of housing types in some of our developments so that individuals, like my family, we started with a very small, under 1,000 square foot house, 40 something years ago. And eventually we were able to accumulate some additional wealth, move up to bigger houses. But what I'd like is for people to be able to move into an area of the county and like that community and be able to move up into different size houses. So I really like, for example, at Southwood, where we see that wide variety of different types of housing. And of course, it's easier to do if you have a large master development like Southwood than it is when you take some of these smaller developments that may only have 30 or 40 units or whatever. But I think it is that blend of different types of housing that really allows for people to have a home in a part of the county and be able to move up over time. One supervisor, my view, but I really do see that we have a responsibility to ensure that more of our community members are able to live within our community. And we know it's a problem right now because we are so much more expensive than a lot of our surrounding communities, our school teachers, our first responders, fire, police, whatever. So often they're not able to afford to live in the county. So I just throw some of that out as how it affects me. Of course, what got most of the news was our gun ordinance yesterday. When the proposal first came before the board on our consent agenda to schedule a hearing, I and all the other supervisors, we voted to approve scheduling a hearing, which took place in late July. But I had a lot of concerns with the initial draft, principally paragraph C6, which would have authorized the county executive to grant an exception to the known gun policy. And it also would have prohibited any weapons in the parking lots at parks, for example. Ultimately, where the consensus of the board came down, and there were some disagreements in terms of, I would say, sort of around the edges, but ultimately all of the supervisors voted for it, is essentially this. If we do not have an ordinance that regulates possession of weapons on county property and county buildings, then we legally do not even have the authority to inquire whether a person is bringing a weapon into the building. And as we all know, workplace violence is a significant health hazard in the United States, and human resource policies almost universally, other than law enforcement or similar, says no guns in the workplace. And that is our human resource policy as issued by the county executive, which is under his authority. And so one of the things that we were looking for was to ensure that we didn't have a situation where county employees were prohibited from having a weapon, but other individuals, which I would just call strangers for these purposes, are able to come into our county buildings with weapons. So what we ultimately came up with is relatively simple. No open carry of any weapons on county property and county buildings. No concealed handgun carry on the person in any of the buildings or parking lots, or any of the buildings or in the parks, but an individual is permitted, if they're lawfully able to possess a weapon, to have it secured in their vehicle. Now, the newspaper this morning said or vessels, but we actually deleted that language from it. And part of the reason that we did that, which is a little different than the initial proposal, was because I and the other supervisors did not want to have a county resident who lawfully can leave their home with a weapon inadvertently be violating the law by driving onto county property. So for example, if you have business that you want to do at the county office building and you lawfully can possess a weapon, you can drive into the parking lot, secure the weapon in your vehicle, and go into the building. If you go to the parks, you can secure it in your vehicle and you can go into the parks. But you cannot carry the weapon on you out of your vehicle into the parks or into the county office building or on the county grounds. Now, this is not a law of general application, and that's important because we've all heard the saying, ignorance of the law is no excuse, but that only applies to laws of general application, which come from the legislature. Because this is a law of special application as a county ordinance, the regulation is only applicable where the county posts signs. And so the specific language of the signs has not been drafted yet, but it basically will have signs in the parking lots at county property and at the buildings and at the parks that say, you know, weapons not permitted, secured in your vehicle, something like that. There are a number of people who were, I mean, we got really a lot of language, both for and against. I would say if you just want to look at numbers, which is not necessarily determinative, it was more in favor of not permitting weapons at the parks or in the county buildings, but there was a vocal number of people who also were in favor of no regulations. But, you know, we can't carry our weapons to a lot of places. When you go to vote in a school, airports, sporting events, military installations. So in those respects, it's not prohibiting someone from having a weapon. It's just saying, if you have it, leave it secure in your vehicle. And again, if Liz has some other questions or comments, we did have several of the well, I'll add a couple of other things. Several of the supervisors, myself included, initially started with the idea of perhaps having an exception to that policy for concealed handgun permit carriers. But then we ran into the problem of people bringing weapons into the county office buildings, which is a workplace when the county employees are not permitted to do it. And also we wanted to have a simple, concise, consistent message that we could send out to our community, which is don't bring weapons on your person, you know, into county property. We did think, and we did discuss the distinction between our distant rural parks where physical safety may be more of a concern, but we also had to take into account our urban parks where, you know, people walk with their children. And so anyway, there's a lot of information in the record. And I actually drafted up some pretty detailed comments, which I read during the session yesterday. We continue to have homestays come before the board, as we expect will continue. Right now, we're looking at moving the special exception requirement that applies to the 125 foot minimum setback to the property line, becoming an administrative determination by county staff rather than having to come before the Board of Supervisors, because we know that county staff is responsible, and if they see that it's a situation that really should go before the board, they'll send it up to us that way. But that saves substantial amount of time, because what we were informed of is for every homestay that comes before the Board of Supervisors for action, there's about 30 or 40 hours worth of staff work that's involved in preparing all of the documentation, the package, and all of that stuff. And so that also will provide an efficiency, because virtually all of those have been approved with very few exceptions, and the few exceptions being where there was something noticeable about that particular 125 foot section that really did need Board of Supervisors attention. We had a number of people last night speak about supporting the county providing funding to attorneys for eviction cases to represent individuals facing eviction. And I want to point out several things here. One is we have heard from people asking us to give money to the entities, Legal Aid Justice Center, for example, to fund observers and attorneys. We have not, to my knowledge, received a request from those entities to receive the money. And anecdotally, I would say the information that I have received is that they have the financial resources they need to assist the individuals. I also have a bit of a concern in the respect that I call the individual landlord versus the corporate landlord. And I know many people who have homes, maybe they've moved up to another home and a larger home, and they're renting rather than selling, they're renting out the first home, or maybe they've just been able to acquire a few properties. And while I have great empathy and understanding for the plight of individuals who are facing eviction and the financial consequences, as an aside, I would say that's what I deal with in my private law practice on a regular basis. I have a problem with focusing solely on tenants to the exclusion of individual landlords in terms of county resources, because while the tenant may face consequences if evicted, the landlord faces consequences if they don't receive the rent, can't pay their mortgage, in which case they may now be in a financial situation where they potentially could face eviction from their home as well. So I really think there needs to be a bit of a balance in there. The county does give money towards helping in these situations. And I was recently quoted in an article, and I stand by this, that while I support both efforts, I would really prefer giving money towards the landlords and the tenants, the individual landlords and the tenants, to help them in these eviction situations rather than simply funding attorneys or entities. And I'll just kind of leave it like that. And those are, I guess, the big things I've got. Liz, I'll turn it over to you for other comments or different perspectives on how you do all things.
I can just add one thing to your last subject, was that the state, we found out, we got information about what the state was going to have in their tranches of money. And one was, I think, $2.5 million for dealing with
Attorneys.
eviction and attorney's fees. And so we don't know what that's going to look like at this point. We don't know how that's going to be doled out, but that's another reason for us not to use our ARP money for that when there's lots of other things to use it for. But I agree with Donna on everything she said on that. I'd much rather give it directly to folks rather than to lawyers. Not that I have anything against lawyers. As
a lawyer, I enjoyed saying that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And I'll make a comment on your first subject matter of the racial covenants. And yes, it's a terrible thing. And I guess we've known for quite some time that racial covenants in our area and in most areas around the country, in cities and small cities and whatnot, and counties were just atrocious. But when we are, most of these with the county, where the Board of Supervisors gets to have a say in what kind of housing is going in, is in the urban area, and it's for rezoning. And not that I don't agree with Donna on putting a multitude of different sizes of houses and so people can stay in one area. But I think paying attention in those situations, primarily to urban design, is really important, because then you will have some smaller houses with trees and green spaces and with kind of quality of life that we want for all the different stages of people's economic growth, respect to housing. And I did ask the question during that meeting, how do you expect a comprehensive plan?
Liz, I think you're breaking up a little bit on us.
More information
Is everybody else having trouble hearing Liz?
So
Yeah,
I
Liz.
just say that.
Yeah,
Because
Liz, why don't
I think that,
we
Okay.
pause your comments
I'll
there, Liz? I think you're going through a rough cell signal right now.
James, can I add one other thing? I apologize, I forgot. From my VORCAC, Village of Urbana CAC meeting a few weeks ago, a major topic of discussion was the difference in density calculation between net density and gross density. And net density ultimately results in a lower number of units because you're eliminating green space, roadways, things like that. Whereas gross density can result in a higher number of units because you take the total area and then you divide, in terms of how many units are going to be developed. And there are some inherent conflicts in there in the sense that residents tend to prefer net density because that reduces the number of units that are being developed. Developers tend to prefer gross density because that allows them to build a greater number. And we have zoning, master plan, comprehensive plan issues where there is some conflict built into the language and some of that. So I did ask, and county staff did provide through Charles Rapp, a bit of a definitional description of those differences. But it's also something that I reminded the county staff that as we go through our reviews, that bringing into more harmony our language is very important. And then I will add one other aspect of this, and that is, as you know, the county has this plan that 5% of the county will be the development area and 95% will be the rural area. The more we build, I'm not going to necessarily say to maximum capacity, but the more we build to density in the development area, the longer it can be that we're able to maintain that 5%, 95%. Because if we don't build to sufficient density in that 5%, we will max it out in a shorter period of time, which means that the county will, in a sooner point in time, assuming that the county continues to grow in population as it has, the sooner we're going to have to expand out into the rural area. And so it is, again, this balance that we have to take into account. Again, one supervisor, but I'm committed to trying to maintain that 5%, 95% as long as possible, because what we don't want is the sprawl that we see in so many other areas. And I've commented on that. I came back from Atlanta just a few weeks ago, my mother's 91st birthday. And, if you've seen the census map that has just come out and you look at the development, you see sprawl everywhere. And again, this goes back to that symbiosis that we've got of wanting to have the development that we need for our quality of life while maintaining the natural heritage and beauty of the region. So thank you, James, for letting me add that additional comment.
Donna, it sounds like you read the same Washington Post article that I do. I saw that same thing in there. I almost brought this up earlier, but it seems appropriate to bring it up now that I've noticed, at least on the Avon Street Extended and Route 20 corridor, there's a lot of neighborhoods that are just sort of one-offs. It's like 6, 7, 8, 10 acres that are developed with no intent to ever connect it to another neighborhood. And I think, to your point of having multiple housing types in the same neighborhood, the more that we can encourage those developers to connect, like it was 2 months ago or 3 months ago when Avinity 1, Avinity 2, or the property next to it, and the residents were very vocal about not wanting the neighborhoods to connect. But as somebody who doesn't live in either one of those neighborhoods, it makes it feel very divorced from each other not to have a through street there. And I see that with Galaxy Farm too.
Yeah, James, you were right on. There's an area in Virginia Beach off of a road called Mill Creek, if you're familiar with First Colonial and Great Neck Corridor.
Very, yeah.
There are about, 8 or 10 streets off Mill Creek that are exactly what you've described. They're one-offs. And what it ends up doing is it means you don't really have a neighborhood because you can't connect with your neighbors. So you've got the 8 houses on your street that you can connect with, but you can't even walk in between. Now, we do know that VDOT does require in many circumstances that there be a second access point, not onto the same street. We're dealing with that over at the Breezy Hill repeatedly. And I've seen in other areas where even some of these smaller developments, they are being required to have this pre-built every way that you can connect to the adjacent parcel. Kind of an advantage and disadvantage of these one-offs is that it does end up providing a variety of housing types. But I totally agree with you that an interconnection between them is what builds a community rather than simply a road.
We're over time already, but I did see two hands, and I want to get those before we wrap up. So David, over to you.
Thank you, James. And thank you both Donna and Liz for your comments about these things. I did want to echo a little bit of what Donna and now James were saying both about the ability to live within a community or an area and sort of progress through, because it's something we can see very easily in our growth area, because you see apartments going up right in front of Avinity right now. And so you can see people moving into those apartments. They have a bigger family, they get some money, they can move into Avinity right there. If things change and they end up wanting to be in a single family home at the back of Avinity or back on the backside at Galaxy Farm, they can do that, stay within the same school district, but still make those types of moves. And that's something that I think does add to our part of the county. And it's hard when other CACs don't see the benefits that come from that. There are certainly some vocal people out in Crozet who do want it, but there are also others who don't. I had one question about the gun policy because this came up at a Scouts BSA meeting I was at last night. The Cub Scouts, the scouting district, runs a day camp out at Chris Green Lake Park. And one of the things we get to do is shoot BBs. And we were wondering, are BB guns covered under the definition of a firearm in the ordinance? I didn't know if that came up during the discussion. We certainly have to up our lobbying efforts if it didn't, but we may have to move our Cub Scout camp, which attracts about 120 or 130 Cub Scouts from Green, Orange. We had some people from over as west of Stanton this year. So I was just curious about that, if anybody knew that yet.
I'm gonna
or if I need to go ask county attorney.
Yeah, well, that's who we're going to have to go to. I'm going to offer what and I apologize. I actually left my binder in my truck because I always go to meet with the mayor and town administrator in Scottsville after a board of supervisors meeting, and I forgot to bring it in. I believe that the weapons that we deal with talk about using an explosive to propel a projectile. And because I don't believe BB guns fall in that category, even though I'm a lawyer, I'm not the county attorney. Don't take this as legal advice. I believe that that would be permissible, whereas 22s would not be, for example. But that's a question we need to ask the county attorney to be sure we get it right.
What's the best way for me to do that, or have the local scouting executives do that?
If you would just send me an email.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that way I make sure I've got you attached to it. I will forward that to the county attorney, who's going on vacation tomorrow and we'll be gone for a good time. And we'll get the answer to you.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, David.
And then MK, wrap us up, please.
Thank you. I just want to speak a little bit about what Donna was saying regarding the different types of housing and allowing for variety, and the development, keeping the development within that 5% area. I do think one of the issues that we see is there are enough people either in the area or people moving to the area who desire housing and can afford it, who want a little bit more space. And so maybe they don't want 2 acres, but they also don't want, a townhouse. And so I think we lack enough neighborhoods like mine, like Mosby, like Redfields, where you get a quarter to a half an acre with a single family house. And we have enough people who want that it drives the price for that up significantly, which then drives the prices up for everybody. And so there is a counterbalance there when you're talking about density, and different types of housing at different price points, that the overall housing affordability can also be served by providing areas with the type of housing that is in demand, so it's just another,
Totally agree.
yeah. Another way to think, because we don't have, at least I have plenty of clients who are looking for that, and they go to Crozet, but right now housing inventory, resale inventory is so low. The builders can't keep up. There's not enough area of development, and that's not a local problem. That's a national problem. But, I think it is a balance between that high density stuff and then the also not so high density, single family houses.
I agree. We really need all types of housing for all different types of situations. Some people want to buy, some want to rent. Some just need an efficiency. And that's, so Mary Kay, I totally agree with you. Where my concern comes in is if we look to preclude or exclude from vast segments of the county varieties of housing. I don't think that is in our long-term best interests in terms of a community.
I agree with you.
Well, we'll wrap up there. Thank you, everybody, for a productive meeting. My biggest takeaway was I completely underestimated how much work Craig does every month when we do these minutes. It is not sustainable trying to chair a meeting and write minutes at the same time. So remind me to give him a big thank you when we meet next. But it was great seeing everybody. If there's no further questions, I make a motion. Donna, can I do this? I make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Yeah, and go and vote for it if you make a motion.
Great. Well, our next meeting is tentatively scheduled for Monday, September 27th. That'll be the all hands joint CAC meeting, and opportunities for the public to access and participate in the electronic meeting will be posted at a later date in accordance with Emergency Ordinance 20 TAC Alpha 16 and open meeting requirements of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act. I hereby adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.